release from mental, physical, and spiritual depression via practicing yoga and meditation. By the late 1960s, Hindu spirituality becomes popular among young people, the hippies, and the age of the guru reaches its height, its zenith. Eastern and Indian musical theories become an element in rock, jazz, and pop records. A virtual sitar explosion, a far-reaching popularization of Indian music happens. Now, the Beatles, especially George Harrison, have much to do with the arrival of Indian music's vibrating, wiry jangle into mainstream Western culture. In 1965, while wandering around the set of the movie Help, the follow-up to A Hard Day's Night, which was Help was originally entitled or called Eight Arms to Hold You. If you find early pressings of the soundtrack, it actually says, especially the single, says from the film Eight Arms to Hold You. Well, anyway, George stumbles upon a sitar that's, hanging around among the props that are strewn about the movie set. Now, something clicks in George's mind and soul, and the mystic Beatle, the quiet one, becomes fascinated with Indian Hindu spirituality and uses the instrument, uses the sitar for the first time on Norwegian Wood, a song that is found on the classic Rubber Soul album. George even gets a life-size fountain statue of Lord Shiva put into his home. He meets master sitarist Ravi Shankar at a party in London, and they, of course, become lifelong friends, as well as occasional collaborators. Shankar becomes a superstar overnight after decades of extensive training in the sitar, practicing his hypnotic music 10 to 12 hours a day. Anyway, the Byrds, the Kinks, the Yardbirds, and the Rolling Stones follow the Beatles' example and soon release singles with an Indian feel or influence. The Rolling Stones' Painted Black, actually reaches number one on the charts, and features a masterful sitar obbligato by the late, great Brian Jones. Now, Donovan, Traffic, and Procol Harum soon follow suit, and the sitar becomes an essential accessory to classic rock. Now, in 1967, George and his wife, Patty Harrison, traveled to India, so George can take sitar lessons from his friend Ravi. Patty Harrison becomes the first one in the Beatles' inner circle to be introduced to yoga and transcendental meditation. When she meets the Maharaji Mahesh Yogi, who is actually originally from the Himalayas, the Maharishi travels tours India, Burma, Singapore, North America, and Europe, and makes a name for himself in the process. The yogi gives lectures on the dawning of the age of enlightenment, and quietly states that transcendental meditation, the mantra technique, can lead practitioners to the field of pure consciousness and can greatly enhance one's, physical and psychological well-being. Via the mantra, says the yogi, an individual can move beyond the superficial thought processes that rule or govern our lives, and encounter a deeper level of consciousness. Well, he tells the wide-eyed mystical Beatle, the quiet one, George, that he, the Maharishi, can teach him, George, how to tap into, how to reach and manipulate a higher or greater creative intelligence. The guru also tells Mr. Harrison that the ancient Vedic meditative process has over the centuries become confused, and that the correct practice can only be taught by qualified teachers. Basically him. Spiritual educators who will help bring on this new age of enlightenment. The mystical Beatle George becomes a disciple of the Maharishi and soon begins practicing yoga postures. He begins to meditate, and he begins to read key English translations of ancient Sanskrit texts. The search for God and enlightenment becomes a major part, a key ingredient within George Harrison's music for the rest of his life. All right, with that, February 1968, George has turned on the other Beatles to the idea of Hindu spirituality and transcendental meditation. The group is still in mourning over the death of their beloved manager Brian Epstein, and they're also in the process of creating Apple Corp's Apple Records Limited. So they need some serious stress relief. They decide to spend some days in serious meditation and listen to the lectures by the yogi, lectures that are deep inside the shine of the moonlight on the clear and, cool, soft Indian nights. The Beatles are in, as I mentioned, the grueling process of establishing Apple Records and desire temporary peace of mind and no distractions to hamper their creativity. So all four Beatles, their wives, their girlfriends, their assorted entourages, and friends like Donovan and the Beach Boys' Mike Love, make the long trip to India. It will be the first time the Beatles will be totally cut off from their fame and the rest of the world in years. Now, the party arrives in Delhi to find wild monkeys leaping around the airport onto the terminal roof. The Beatles, of course, and their party are exhausted. The monkeys cavort and run around like they own the place. The Beatles have brought acoustic guitars, and Ringo gets a tabla, an Indian drum, as a gift. The jet-logged group then travels by taxi to a distant village called Rishikesh, a village that is by the banks of the Ganges River. Then they travel via, jeeps, and then on the backs of donkeys until the road becomes too dangerous for the animals, so they have to walk the last mile or so. Then they must cross a, dangling rope bridge that hovers over a muddy chasm in order to finally reach the gates of the Maharishi's ashram. The group's luggage would arrive sometime later, coming via an oxen-driven caravan of carts. The Beatles and their entourage have become seekers of knowledge in the Yogi's Meditation Academy, a type of spiritual campus, a campus of rustic stone bungalows that are whitewashed, air-conditioned chalets, essentially, that are comfortable and have all the modern conveniences. The Swami's spiritual school, his meditation academy, has its own post office, its own laundry, as well as a massive dining hall. John Lennon breaks the ice with the holy man or guru by patting the Maharashi's head. He pats the yogi on the head as the Swami sits down on his deerskin, telling the holy man, there's a good guru, just before the holy man's lesson begins. Now, the English seekers of divine knowledge, the Beatles, assemble day after day, assemble against the morning heat and quiet balminess inside an open-air amphitheater for lessons. The yogi gives long, rambling talks that speak of levitation and suspended animation. Now, gradually, these talks become shorter, and the periods of individual meditation become longer. The Beatles and their friends become relaxed. They become happy, and a creative spark ignites, and a bunch of new songs pour out of them. For example, John Lennon writes Dear Prudence. George Harrison writes Not Guilty. And Donovan writes Jennifer Juniper. George and John are very much into it and are ready for anything Indian at this point. Paul is not exactly convinced about the benefits of transcendental meditation, and Ringo, at this point, has no opinion about it at all. The Beatles stay at the ashram for several weeks, while the media descends upon the Maharishi Yogi's spiritual school. The media camps out at the gates. The Beatles' search for Nirvana is a major news or media event, and all the main newspapers and television networks have a field day. Now, a serpent, however, a serpent of lust, soon enters the spiritual, this spiritual paradise. When allegations of inappropriate sexual misconduct against the Maharishi Mahesh Yogi soon surface, alleged clandestine sexual scheming, to be exact. The Maharishi is said to have made sexual advances towards Mia Farrow, Prudence Farrow, as well as basically any female that was there, from what I've heard. The Maharishi offers the ladies forbidden food delights, like fried chicken dinners and chocolate desserts, in exchange for sexual activity. John Lennon, upon hearing of this, confronts the Maharishi and basically does not believe the Maharishi's protestations of innocence. Lennon immediately departs and abandons his interest in transcendental meditation and Eastern or Indian Hindu philosophy, but would remain a deeply spiritual person for the rest of his life. George Harrison becomes deeply disappointed with the Maharishi and does not know what to think. But George chooses to wash his hands of the guru as well. He says enough of this. He still believes in the soundness of the guru's teachings, however. George will, of course, continue to meditate and practice yoga for the rest of his life. His faith in Hindu spirituality is unblemished, untouched, untarnished by the yogi's possible indiscretion. And I say possible because we don't really know if this happened or not. And George becomes a friend and patron of the Radha Krishna Temple and Krishna Consciousness Society. Harrison, George, produces a number of popular singles and albums on Apple Records for the Hare Krishna movement, the Hare Krishna movement. For example, the Hare Krishna Mantra and Govinda Jaya Jaya, which actually are hit singles and do quite well. George also invents the Rock and Roll All-Star Benefit Concert with the Concert for Bangladesh at Madison Square Garden in August 1971. This triple live album sells millions of copies, and the movie does quite well at the box office. As the age of Aquarius begins to hit full tilt boogie, a Swami even turns up at the high point of the hippie counterculture era, the 3-day festival of love, peace, and music, not to mention rain and bad acid, known as the Woodstock Festival. Swami Sachidananda gives